Okay, now we are back from the coffee break. We are still in company of our host, Frederick. We are going to resume our lesson, but before that, I'll simply remember you one more time that you can vote on our mobile application, this talk, so that he will deserve, I hope, his well-deserved ranking with some praise, and maybe next time, next edition, we can give him or a subject like this more space. Thank you.
How does that work? I haven't seen that.
Okay, now let me explain this in case you missed it. On our main site, europython.eu, you find a menu on the top. A voice of this menu says Mobile Guide. You click there, you download the mobile application guidebook, and you can vote each talk based on how much you liked. I hope you liked this as he deserves, because he's doing a tough job in only 4 hours, and it seems to me he's doing fine. So I hope, as a neophyte, I think he has a nice way of explaining things. Even I get to understand much of it, so you are a good teacher at least. Okay? You download the application, you install it, and you can vote each talk, including this one. Okay? No, unfortunately, Guidebook now supports only mobile. Otherwise, I would have voted him already. It's not possible, just mobile. Thanks.
Yeah. Is this on? Yes? Yeah?
Yeah, you can resume.
Even though I see there are still some empty computers, we'll just press on and assume that they either won't return or they will catch up. So the exercise this time was the hot loading of changed code. I can begin with saying that there are errors in the example code, which was found it didn't set the timestamp, so you would get the reload. Once you change the file, you get the reload all the time. But I will do a quick implementation on screen and then we'll continue. And if there are any questions, please just raise your hand and we'll take them. So, we'll need time. Where is my one? I also got a question why I used, in this place in the example code, I used importlib.import module and then handler.module. Why don't I just use get it from sysmodules? And the reason is nothing in particular. I had importlib on the top of my head when I wrote it. So what import module will do is basically the same thing as the import statement. It will check sysmodules first, and if it's there, return it. So you can instead, since we know that we have the handler, which has a module name set, we can just do sys.modules like this, right? Remove the... Oh yeah, sorry. Sorry. So we can do it like this. And that was one of the funny parts of the example implementation. And since I said earlier we're only interested in reloading the plugins, we can just check if they have this load time member that we set earlier. What did I call it? So you can hear me now? Now? No? Yes? Yes? Yeah. Okay. If you're doing this with generically reloading any source that has been changed and so on, you have to know that a module can be anything. Especially in framework development, you can stack anything as of... So you can't guarantee that the module will have a file member or anything like that. The minimum required thing for a module is basically just a namespace where you can look things up. So there are no guarantees here, which is one reason to limit the reloading to stuff you can control how it's loaded. Generic reloading of everything, no matter how it's loaded, isn't this easy. And there's seldom a reason to do it, of course. But it requires you to at least ignore errors and not crash.
Senti una cosa, ora ho provato a rimuoverla e funziona. Dici che non conviene. Grazie.
You remember how I told you can't compare the newly loaded functions to the old ones? The example code does exactly that, even though I thought about it when I did it. So in the example 5, I think that's corrected to example 6. Yes, it is. Where we add more handlers. That won't actually work. It will only add more handlers every time you do it, I believe, because it compares a tuple of function objects, and the old functions won't be the same as the new function, so that won't actually work. So what we can do instead is that we replace the entire handlers list with a new list where we filtered out the ones that are coming from the same module as the one we just reloaded. And I'll just switch mic. So does it work now? Yes? Feels good. And then of course we have to re-add the newly loaded handler. So we do handlers.append, for example, and it's supposed to be a tuple of handler module dot selector handle module dot handler. And one thing more that I forgot in the example, this seems to be the one so far which is messed up, is that of course we have to set a new timestamp here, or it will reload from the first time you changed it and into eternity. So we also have to do load time is time.time. And of course here there is some possibility of something else happening in between here, a file save or so on. I would say for most normal circumstances that's not enough of a problem to actually be a problem. But if you for some reason deploy production code, I shall give you a mic. If you for some reason deploy production code where you depend on this being updated very frequently, you will have to add some kind of synchronization or accept that the timestamp and the modification time might be out of sync. Yes?
If you are limiting yourself to loading things you control which has a file, why don't you use the file mtime?
Instead of stat?
Instead of time.
That is a very good question. There's no reason not to. And then you don't have the synchronization problem. Exactly. So we could actually do, well, we still don't know it will modify between the load time, because the load time of the file isn't stored with the module. So we still have maybe a slightly smaller risk, but we still have the risk of being out of sync actually. Since there's no time modification information in the module where it's loaded. So unless you add some kind of locking, there's always the risk that someone saved it just after you loaded it or just before you loaded it. No.
If you get the file mtime,
Yes,
save that,
yes,
then load.
yes. Then you will never miss an update. That's
Exactly.
true. So that is better. So this one is an improved version. Thank you. Oh, I'm writing in the wrong window again. Here I am. We will do this instead, and like this. And we will not have any lost updates at least. Imp, was there something else? OS? We already have OS. Sys. H for H in handlers, if H local variable handlers. Okay, so we say handlers. You should never ever do this. This is ugly.
And also I think after the not equals, you should have n not underscore module dot done the module.
Where?
One
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, no, not necessarily. Because this one is the one we actually are trying to replace. So this is the... We're not looking at the module of the module. We're looking at the module of the handler and comparing it to the... yes. This is the one we got out. Sorry, we should have... Yes, you are absolutely correct. And we can just say... Actually, handler module.name instead. Like that, right?
I didn't see that, but okay.
Because we're comparing, this would be the old handler, and actually this would be the old selector, but the module name of that one, and we're comparing it to the name of the newly loaded handler of the module. And then we append it. So we basically just filter out anything that came from the same module and we add them. And keeping in mind the amount of errors I made in this exercise, it will be very exciting to see if this works. It loads something. It does not run plugin code because we didn't return anything because I wasn't done with my code. So we still only have a handler, and we need to check if it might actually be none here. We need to actually use the new handler as well. The way I've done it in the example is that we just try to get it again. If it's not valid now, we will get none. With the implementation we have with the list where we just get the first possible one, that's perfectly okay. If we have some kind of selection tree or something, we would have to go through the entire thing again after we've done a reload, because the shape of the tree might have changed. But right now, the only thing we actually... Where is my mouse pointer? The only thing we actually have to do is set handler to be get handler. So we basically do this thing again after we updated the list, which is why I moved this to a function. And then we don't do this, because if handler is none, it's not okay. It's 404 not found. And we can set an out is not found to have custom 404 page. And otherwise, we do the normal start response, and we set out to handler environment. And then we return, no we don't, we yield out. Or return out in list. Yes. So if we try this one instead, this is plugin code. We check if the reloading works by changing the text. And it works. Thank you. That was a sweaty one. So we'll continue. Are there any questions on this? Keeping in mind that this is one way of doing it, and you can do it in other ways. The way that ChairPy does it, and I understand Flask, which does either polling or subscription to events, has the benefit that when you change your code, you will see that it's modified immediately, and you will see if it compiles and loads and so on. Doing it this way, if you deploy broken code, you will only see that it's broken on your first request. On the other hand, the implementation here is simple, if not exactly the things you do every day perhaps, and other ways of doing it are a bit more involved. So it's a question of implementation complexity versus versatility, I suppose. So we'll move on. If we want to do something more with our framework than just have request and return data, if we want to have authentication, if you want to be able to encode data on the fly to different formats and so on, as we want to do if we have an API where we want to sorry. If we have an API, we might want to be able to return different kind of encoded data, and we might not want the handlers to do that. For example, if we have, let's say that we have an API which fetches data from a NoSQL database, giving us a dict with lists and names, basically JSON objects, for example. Okay, so we return them as JSON. But then we have clients who want to use XML for some obscure reason. They don't believe in newfangled things like JSON. Then we either have the option to update all of our applications, or we just update the server with the possibility to take the accept header from the client request and encode the data appropriately. So we would return sort of raw data from the handlers and encode them in the server. But if that part is supposed to be pluggable, we need to be able to use several handlers for the same request and call them sequentially. And that can be passing data through or just calling them. An authentication handler, for example, would be an example of something that you call, and you only really care mostly if you're succeeded or not, and maybe you stick stuff into session information. But data transformation would be something where you actually take the output of another handler and feed it downstream. But we're going to look at one of the most simple ways of doing it, because this will complicate the reloading of stuff. So a simple way of doing it is, instead of like we've done so far, having a list of handlers and just running the first one that matches, we have a list of handlers and we run all that matches. And this of course means that we have to take care of any output, and we could make the choice that the handler should be able to take input as well, to take as input the output from the last call. And it also means that we have to take care of what I spoke of earlier, which is the handlers must be able to determine where they fit in the stack of handlers, even if the stack is a list in this case. And we need to be able to perhaps have default handlers that fall back and check this might return something or it might not. So these things that I've listed here can be done without doing any kind of magic, or at least any kind of magic we haven't already done. Adding support for multiple handlers is basically as easy as running them all. Of course you need to take care of the output and add it to the so yield is your friend if you have more output. When you add an authentication plugin, you need to take care of that is always run before anything else. On the other hand, you might add preprocessors that should be run before anything else as well. So in the end, that will always become application-specific choice. And then adding static content is more of a, most of the time when doing development, you will want to be able to access static content. So you want to be able to map one URL to somewhere on disk and just be able to serve stuff. In production, you normally do that through a caching, high-performance web server, Nginx or Likely or whatever. But in development, it's really, really nifty not having to do that. So there is an example implementation in the folder cleverly named 6. And I will start doing an on-screen implementation of those parts in a couple of minutes. And if there are any questions, raise your hand and you will get a mic. Comments? So since I started with the authentication code, I will briefly showcase what I did. First, I removed the complication of hot swapping code, and we'll re-add it later. Then I basically changed get handlers to get handlers, which just iterates over valid handlers instead of returning the first one. And after that, I try all the handlers, and if they work, I set the status to 200. May or may not be correct, depending on the method used, but we'll use it. And then I return a 404 if there is no output, and otherwise set the status set and return the concatenated data from all of the handlers that matched. If there is an exception, I just set the status to the string value of the exception and send the same but encoded as output. This is probably a bad way of doing it. In the example implementation, I instead use a custom exception where I set the status and a message and so on. Also from yesterday's last talk, you should probably use custom exceptions. But this one is a little bit quicker to write. If you check the example code, I've used, I call it something server exception or something, which I can then use to extract the data I want to send from the status and so on explicitly, which is a nicer way of handling it. Also, that means I don't have to catch everything here and try to convert it into a valid HTTP status message. But this will work. So my authentication plugin, which I have modified for some reason, is really simple. I want it to run all the time, so my selector just returns true. I could also have it run for configured URLs, or for everything under secured, or everything running HTTPS. Since all of this information is in environment, or I could get it from another plugin running before this one. And of course, the handler just checks that you have user equals admin in your query string, and then you're obviously allowed in. So this would check against the database. It would probably not just do string matching, but actually extract the data in a field storage, which is available in the standard library. The problem with this implementation so far is that if this authentication plugin is called before or after any other handlers, is entirely dependent on the order the plugins were loaded. So what we have to do next is to add some way of making sure that this plugin is always loaded before plugins actually doing any work. A simple way to do it is to offload the work of inserting the handler into the list of handlers on the actual handler implementation, which means that it can determine where it should fit. So if we have just a list, a sane way would be to put authentication and pre-processing first in the list using insert, and anything doing an actual work last in the list. It won't do any fine-grained sorting, but it will suffice to make sure authentication is always run before any work. So when we load them, instead of doing handlers append, we could do mod.add perhaps, instead of this one. And then we need to add this to our plugins, so it becomes part of our contract with the plugins, that we have an add method that takes a list of handlers, and since this is a proper handler doing real work, we append it. Selector handler, and sorry. For the authentication one, I fail at copy-paste. We just instead do insert, prepend. Of course, if you have hundreds and thousands of handlers, you never want to do this because insert isn't very cheap. But you can do it like this. And this will make sure that the authentication is always run before the other handlers. Yes?
I haven't really done any object-oriented programming in Python, but wouldn't you do this with classes and, I don't know, do you have interfaces
You don't
to enforce the contract?
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
No, I wouldn't. There are people who would. I generally don't add a class if I'm not encapsulating both state and behavior, and I'm not. There's no state here. So I don't really see the reason to have a class here. You could do, what I would do if I wanted people to be able to hot deploy code into this, is that I would make my my loading process verify that the correct attributes were there. So I would check that it had a selector, that it was callable. I would perhaps even add inspect code to check that they took the correct number of arguments and so on, if I really didn't want to have any runtime errors. But I wouldn't go so far as to set a schema, because we're all consenting adults here, and if the right parts are in place, who am I to say how you should implement it? Because in this case, those are modules, but someone else might implement a plugin that is a class or an object and stick it into there, and that would work. So by trying to add interface, I think there are some projects that have implementation of interfaces, but I don't generally see the point of it. I do see the point of adding limitation on what's allowed, and especially as a documentation saying that this is the way it's supposed to look. So you could, for example, add base class for plugins, an abstract base class for plugins, where you basically get the same thing. You have to implement some stuff. But that's about as far as I would go. And by then you would add the class and the extra noise from the class just to enforce the contract. So that depends a bit on your use case. If you have hundreds of people adding plugins, it might be worth it. If not, I would generally say not. And I would rather add validation on load than add static, compile time sort of things, actually. So are you all done with this, or do you want me to implement the rest of it? There are static files and loading the plugins, because I can just jump to the next one otherwise. Jump. Jump. I see some people saying jump and no one saying wait, so we can just push on. And we can get to pie beer early, or wherever. I can show you the, of course you can see it, but I can still talk about it. The, not available here, maybe available here. Oh, not very interesting. The example implementation has a mechanism where when we have multiple handlers, it will actually reload all of them every time before every request. Because that's when you do reload on the fly and you have possibly multiple matches, it's not as easy as just removing it and re-adding it. Because you can't do that while you're iterating, or you can do it, it won't break. But if you add it in the beginning, you won't match that authentication the first time it's loaded. So when you're beginning to have multiple handlers, maybe you should look at doing polling or file system subscriptions instead. But for our last part, actually, we will be talking about creating domain-specific languages. How many of you have used like Django or any other project which has domain-specific languages? Internal, that is. Yeah, a fair amount. So a domain-specific language is basically a mini language specifying how you do things that are specific for a domain. Django's class model isn't always referred to as a DSL, but that's what it is, because we have a specific way of writing this, which tells us that we create a poll, we have char fields and datetime, so we actually create HTML from this. And Django does it using meta classes and they do introspection on those to be able to generate the templates, to be able to generate the HTML, more or less. And this is different from doing external DSLs, which is when you create a whole new language and create a parser for it, and then generate or run the behavior. So creating an external DSL is actually no different from writing any other compiler in Python kind of thing. Possibly easier because you're only interested in very few cases. And the benefits of creating a DSL is that you can, well, the benefit is really that you limit the vocabulary you're using to create, for example, a web page. So you have to keep track of less details. You maybe don't have to keep track of, you don't need to know HTML. You can do introspection on those models, which is harder to do on HTML. You can enforce that they always look the same way, because you can't write your own documents. You just describe this is what the document should look like. And this can be good and bad. There are cases where DSLs are just in the way and you really should just write some Python instead. And there may be cases where it's a lot easier to give someone a DSL to write their pages in than to ask them to write HTML or to write Python. For me, I usually just write HTML and JavaScript myself. Or I have been known to even use Django like this. But we are going to not look at a class-based DSL, because you can look at Django for that. So what we are going to look at is a function-based DSL instead. This, as you can see, is valid Python code, which describes a web page. There's the page variable is set to the result of page, which is called with the result of header, which is sent a title, and then the body sent a heading, some paragraph, one paragraph at least, and a form which has some fields, action, and so on. And it's really easy creating those things. It's really hard to change them once you have more than 5 users though. So a fair amount of time should go into how you declare them. And I believe it's debatable whether this is a better way of writing a home page than writing the HTML. On the other hand, what is not debatable is that it's a lot easier doing introspection on something like this, and it's a lot easier enforcing that all of your pages, all of your output looks the same. And of course this can be used for anything, not just creating a web page. Creating documents is the easy part, because you just implement each of the functions and you make them generate the correct output. But you basically often create an internal DSL if you do, for example, control scripts for some kinds of hardware where you say you have these functions, you have move left, move right, lower whatever device you have, activate, and so on. And when you do that and you actually say that the script should look like this and they shouldn't contain other stuff, that's an internal DSL. And those may be very useful because basically you can have people who know nothing about actual programming but can understand stapling instructions to a machine doing this. And as an added benefit, this might as well have been another programming language with similar syntax. On the other hand, if you really wanted to become programming language independent, you would have to create a document which you parse or make a proper external DSL. There have been DSLs implemented in, like, so you have a JSON document which describes whatever you want to do, and that could also be called a proper DSL, internal or external, depending on if you're doing JavaScript or not. So there is a file called page.py which tries to import stuff. I believe the example tries to import everything from page renderer and then run this. So I would like you to make that work and generate a valid web page with a header, a body, a paragraph, a form which you can send a username. You can copy the plugin doing this, which is called Page or something, from exercise 7 if you want to. Otherwise it's easy to write it. And I'll start writing this in a few minutes on screen. Are there any questions? No. The plugin using this is actually called app, just app, and it also adds a specific content type to the handler function as an annotation, more or less, so that it can be used by the server to set the content type, because otherwise, even though you return HTML, it will display as text. Sorry?
You didn't add the server acceptance.
I didn't, but it's in 6.py. It's there. It's in 7. At the top of server.py in 7. There's class server exception. No problem. Why is this one? Okay, so lucky me, you wanted to push ahead because I just realized we're almost running out of time. This is a bit to type, but it's hopefully not very difficult. If we had used a class-based approach, we would probably have created some kind of aggregator word, so we didn't have to do this twice. And all of those are basically the same. One text argument put into template and so on. And of course, with functions you can do the same, create a function that generates those for you. But this is the simplest way of doing it, just basically looking at our example of the language and implementing all of it. The only thing we need to do is make sure that every part of it resolves to something, and this is basically like resolving any parse tree while writing any other programming language. Even though this is a silly mini language in Python, the principle is the same. You go down to the smallest part you can evaluate, and you do that, and then you move out from there. The things we had to add to make this work as an application in the server we created earlier is, I don't know if you saw or if you had the same issue yourself, that first when you implement it you just see the HTML source. And as I said, I added functions are just objects and we can stick anything to them. So I just add a content type member to this handler and set it to text HTML. And then while running the handlers, I check if any of the handlers I run have a content type set. I use that content type. And in this case, I always use the content type of the last handler with it set, which might or might not make sense in a specific use case, but it's definitely one way of doing it. So this is basically all we had to do to make this work. And normally, or if I had written this for serious use, I would actually have had a contract with the handlers that they don't return the raw data. They return some kind of response object, probably, with the status code, content type and data separately. And maybe even whether this handler is allowed to pass control to the next handler in row, or if it should always abort after it's run. But this would all depend on your specific use case. Doing it like we've done it now works, but is perhaps a bit limited. Doing some custom classes, which are basically structs, has the benefit over passing, for example, just dicts with the same data, that they are auto-completed. You can have your editor tell you when you're adding stuff that's not there, and so on. So I would recommend it. I have done lots of passing around dicts with data in my day, and I've started to realize that it's obfuscating code. It's really easy when you're doing the development and it's all at the top of your head, but having structs, even if they're Python classes for your data, is really a simple way of making your code a lot easier to read. Also, it's easier to write just dot than writing the access for a dict. I also managed to get an error which the validator caught, just to show you that the validator works, where the validator said that the status code wasn't valid. I accidentally put the response type in the status code, and that would have passed silently on lots of servers. And most, I think, web browsers wouldn't care actually, but the validator catches it. So again, the validator is really nice to have while you're doing development of fairly low-level WSGI stuff. Oh yeah, I didn't even show that slide. So, are there any further questions? Because otherwise we will wrap up. Mike? Raise your hand again.
Is this something you actually use in production, or was this to deconstruct the structure of a whiskey app?
Let's go through the... I use Bear. I don't use this type of custom routing. I do use for APIs. I use routing based on, I have a package with handlers in it, and then I do introspection to find them, and then you can access them by their name in the tree.
Mm-hmm.
So I do one version of this in production. Loading modules, yes, basically the same answer. And hot swapping, not exactly like this. I actually do subscription, but on the other hand I don't care because it's only ever going to run on one platform, or it's worth the effort if it's going to run on something else. Yes?
Did you get your answer? Yeah, absolutely.
I could go through the other ones before the next question. Yeah. The REPL access, yes. I very seldom use what this gives, but I do have it in production, and I actually have this as a configuration variable, so I don't have this started all the time. But if I do run into weird problems in 2 different servers at least, I have the possibility to turn this on during maintenance and then try to find they're alive. The reason I don't use this all the time is obviously because it's really easy to break. If you're fiddling around with live code in production, you can break stuff. And since I do mistakes, I try not to do it if I don't have a really good reason. Reloading code on the fly, yes. This one doesn't really give anything. No. Internal DSLs, yes. I did a talk last year on doing protocol specifications in Python, which is another way of doing this. The implementation looks very different because we use inspect to inject stuff into the namespace and make a declarative looking mini language for protocol specifications. But yeah, that's the one that's in production. I've used it for toy problem or smaller problems, throwaway problems before, but that's the one that is in active production today that I have written. Yeah.
When you say, you said you use subscription.
Yes.
To trigger reloading.
Yes.
What does that mean? Is that kind of like I notify on?
Yes. Exactly.
That's exactly
so events, yeah, that's what it is on Linux. And on Windows you have some other API call. It was actually ages since I implemented that, so I don't remember the specifics. But at least on Windows and Linux, it's possible to do. I should probably say event-based or OS event, something like that. So that's what I mean, yes. Finally, or are there any further questions? No. The PDF of the slides is up now. I uploaded it in the... I hope it's up now. I tried to upload it. I didn't check that it was actually successfully uploaded. And the other Bitly link up there, if you could spare 3 minutes for a short Google form to tell me what you think, that would be really helpful. Especially since this is the first iteration of this course, any input is valuable. If you have the time. Thank you. No.
Also remember to vote him on the guidebook app, so to give him some immediate feedback.